As the CEO and the leader of this organization, think a lot about wanting to make sure that our services are so effective and far reaching that each woman who comes to us is the last in her family to need us. Because if we don't think about it that way, then in 20 years, we'll be serving the daughters of the women we serve today. And I don't think that should be okay with us. I would love to run out of chronically unemployed women in Denver. And we have to do something crazy like hire men.
That's the voice of Tamra Ryan, longtime CEO of the Women's Bean Project and a powerful advocate for employment-based social enterprise. Over 2 decades of transformative and courageous leadership, Tamra has helped thousands of women move from crisis to stability while guiding her own organization through major growth and cultural evolution. Now, as she prepares to step away from her day-to-day role, Tamra reflects on some of the challenges she's faced, the lessons in vulnerability she's picked up along the way, and why she refuses to let fear get in the way of fulfillment. My name is Buddy Teaster, President and CEO of Souls for Souls, and you're listening to the Repurpose Podcast, featuring candid conversations with business leaders who share the ups and downs, the wins and challenges they face along the way, and how they learn to overcome them. These are the real stories of going from tailspin to tailwind. Hey, Tamra, it's really great to see you here.
It's good to catch up with you, buddy.
Yeah, thanks. So, look, we're going to talk a little bit about, as we usually do on this podcast, which is called Repurpose. So we're going to talk about purpose. You're one of the easier guests to talk about since it's been so baked into your life, especially in the role that you're in. But also want to talk about tailspin to tailwind. And we'll thread that throughout the conversation, but we'll do those two things. And I think the place to start is, how did you get to where you are? Who are you? Those kinds of things, so people have a little bit of sense of the woman that we're talking to.
Okay, where to start? I am the CEO of an employment social enterprise called Women's Bean Project. We believe that all women have the power to transform their lives through employment. So we hire women experiencing chronic unemployment. Typically, she hasn't had a job longer than a year in her lifetime, though the average age is mid-30s. She comes to work for us for 6 to 9 months in our food manufacturing business, where we're helping her work on herself and work in our food manufacturing business. At the end, she goes on to a job in the community. I think one of the most important things when you do this kind of work is you want to make sure that change sticks.
Yeah.
So a year after completing our program, over 96% of women are still employed. I think that's the tailspin
Yeah.
to tailwind. Also, when she comes to us, she's been in a tailspin for a long time. What we're really hoping to make sure is that she's on a trajectory when she leaves us.
Thanks for making that so easy to transition. But the tailspin part, we'll talk about some of your own tailspin. You know, it's not been a straight line up and to the right the whole way. But the women that you work with, almost by definition, have been or are in the tailspin when you meet them. How do you assess, like, hey, can we help this woman? Does she fit here? You know, you have a program and a way that you approach it. What's your process for making sure that it will stick?
It's a few things. And what it fundamentally comes down to is her readiness for change.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about how women don't come to the Bean Project to stay the same. So when we're interviewing, and just to give you a sense, we hire 4 times a year, typically for between 8 and 15 spots, depending on which hire date. We have 200 applicants. So that's a lot of women and applicants to go through to determine fundamentally, is she ready to change her life? Sometimes what that looks like is, and one of the things I know for sure, and this applies to many of your listeners have known people who have struggled with addiction.
Yeah.
And you can't look at one person and say, gosh, that must be their rock bottom. Everyone's rock bottom is their own rock bottom. And so we really are trying to not just assess how, let's say, bad it is for her, is whether or not she's ready to have a different life. And usually that's because she's motivated to, say, get custody of her kids back, or she really, one woman said once, I used to say I don't want my kids to grow up to be like me. And then I realized, instead of not wanting them to be like me, I need to be somebody my kids can be proud of.
Wow.
That's change language. So those are kinds of things that we're listening for.
I kind of got goosebumps with the way she said that. That must have been an amazing moment. Tamra, can you mentioned it, and if you're hiring people and you've been doing this for a long time, Women's Bean Project is 20 plus years old?
35.
35. What's the business behind that? I mean, it sounds fine, food manufacturing, but what do you do, and how does that generate the opportunities that you can create for these women?
We are, as I said, a food manufacturer. We started with our first product was a bean soup mix. And that's where our name comes from. That's why we're called Women's Bean Project. Today, we have 50 different SKUs that we distribute all across the US. So, from 6 different kinds of bean soup mix
Mhm.
to baking mixes to snacks. It's a really wide variety. And we are a dry food manufacturer.
Mm.
And so that's fundamental to what we do is that we don't bake anything. We just prepare foods and distribute them. We have recently evolved into having a lot of ready to eat items
Mm.
because we've seen that over 35 years, the way
Yeah.
people eat in our country has shifted.
Sure. So the women that you hire, this is a two-part question. Are they mostly on the manufacturing side? It's a job that you can come in and learn and do for a certain amount of time, and you're, like you said, constantly hiring. But the second part is, how do you do the business part? I know some of the people that you sell to, they are rigorous. It's hard to do. It's hard to maintain. They have high bar. So how do you merge those two things?
I say this a lot. We're doing two businesses really under one roof. Yes, we're a food manufacturer and we're highly regulated. We are inspected by the FDA. We have a high level of food safety certification, which allows us to get into those national grocery chains
Yeah.
and things like that. So the standard is quite high for us. And we're a human services organization. So we're intentionally hiring women. We don't know if they're going to come to work every day. We work with them over the 6 to 9 months and help them become great employees. And as soon as they become great employees, it's time for them to let them go and become somebody else's great employee. It's really kind of a hard way to run a
It's kind of a
business.
crazy model. Yeah.
Yes, it really is because, most businesses are trying to hire people who will have longevity. Once you
Yeah.
invest in the training, you don't want them to leave. What we've had to settle for or on is that we have to be really great at training.
Hmm.
So women come in and we have standard operating procedures, SOPs for everything that we do. And our goal is that by the time she has been fully trained, she can come in and look at a list and say, oh, we're supposed to make 1,000 units of 10 bean soup today.
Hmm.
And so I know what to do. I can set up the production line. I know the whole process. And there are incentives for them to
Hmm.
meet the production requirements. So they spend about 70% of their paid time working in the business in some way. That also includes our shipping and receiving department because we're
Sure.
constantly, every day, we're sending shipments across the US, both to individuals and to stores that carry our products. We call that the bean job. So that's 70% of their paid time is the bean job. Then 30% of their paid time they're working on themselves. And we call that the U job, the YOU job.
Hmm.
So really they have two jobs with us. I think the U job is probably where the transformation happens,
Hmm.
but we measure also what's happening in the bean jobs. We measure job readiness and we use a tool to show progress in that area so that by the time she leaves us, we can say, based on a neutral tool, that she is job ready. In the same way that on the U job side, we measure self sufficiency, which is our
Mm.
other goal. And we're showing the difference for self sufficiency from when she starts to when she finishes.
What are some of those self-sufficiency? What's the checklist look like for some of that?
It's 18 measures on a 5 point scale, each
Wow.
of them.
Okay.
And so it's a lot of the things you would imagine. Does she have stable housing?
Hmm.
And where on that 5 point scale does she fit in
Yeah.
her housing? Does she have any outstanding legal issues? That's not necessarily something we can help her address, but it's helpful to know because
Hmm.
if she has a pending case during the time she's working with us, that could really sideline her from
Yeah.
work if depending on how that turns out. Most importantly, though, it's in addition to housing, it's how stable is her sobriety? 'Cause
Mm.
most of the women we serve have histories of addiction
Yeah.
and incarceration, and almost always those two are interrelated. How safe is she in terms of her relationships? So, a lot of the women we serve have been in violent situations,
Hmm.
or even during the time she's with us, as she's developing better self efficacy
Hmm.
and having some power because she's making an income,
Yeah.
she might start triggering a partner
Yeah.
to try to become more controlling. So we're looking at all kinds of things like that. Physical health is another factor. Mental health as separate from sobriety
Hmm.
is another factor. So it's all of those things.
Yeah.
When you think about barriers to employment, what I know for sure is they rarely happen singularly.
Yeah.
They're multiple and interrelated and interwoven, and we're really trying to tease those out and help her become as stable as possible.
So, over the 35 years, a lot of women have come through those doors. Are there a few stories that stick with you that are emblematic of the kind of work that you can do?
Absolutely. And when I get that question, I've been the CEO for 21 years. It's a hard question to answer because there have been so many. The ones who stand out most to me are ones where we see the potential for a cycle to be changed.
Yeah.
I think a lot about, as the CEO and the leader of this organization, think a lot about wanting to make sure that our services are so effective and far reaching that each woman who comes to us is the last in her family to need us.
Yeah.
Because if we don't think about it that way, then in 20 years, we'll be serving the daughters of the women we serve
Yeah.
today. And I don't think that should be okay with us. I would love to run out of chronically unemployed women in Denver. And we have to do something crazy like hire men.
Yeah. That could be your rock bottom if you have to hire men, you know.
Right? Oh my gosh. Yes, exactly. One woman came to us when she was 21, and that's typically our youngest
Hmm.
age for hiring, in part because under 21, there are youth services and things
Sure.
like that aren't, and the needs I think are different for someone who's still underage. When she was 12, her mom introduced her to cocaine.
Wow.
At 13, her mom kicked her out of the house because she perceived that she was competition for boyfriends. So at 13, she was on the streets and started hanging out with a bunch of people who, were up to no good.
Yeah.
And she couldn't get a job because she wasn't old enough to be employed. She dropped out of school
Hmm.
because she didn't have a way to go to school every day, and she was involved in this life of addiction and crime until she was 18 when she was arrested. And being arrested at 18 was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to her, because what it did was it forced her to create a new life. She was involved with the criminal justice system until she was 21.
Hmm.
And at 21, her pastor referred her to Women's Bean Project. So she came in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and, fresh scrubbed, and really with a naivete that was more reflective of a 13-year-old
Right.
in a lot of ways, but yet she'd had this life, where that she had been involved in addiction and crime. But that willingness to want to have a different life is really what made a
Yeah.
difference. So she completed our program. She went to work for a grocery store where her first supervisor taught her how to count change. It wasn't a skill that she'd ever had. And she enrolled in an adult high school because she had a third grade reading level.
Man.
So she did both of those things. She eventually finished high school and she met a man who became her husband. And today she lives in North Dakota and she works full time. She has a daughter who's about 11 now.
Hmm.
And what's really great is what she does in her spare time. Her second job is doing counseling at a local prison in her community.
Wow.
And so I think about that in terms of where her life could have gone.
Hmm.
Her daughter will never know a time when her mom doesn't work.
Yeah.
And she and her husband own a couple cars, they own a home. They have a life that really was not a given when she was
No.
21 years old when she came to the Beam Project. So I think a lot about her in terms of this transformation and this trajectory that we won't serve her daughter. It's
Yeah.
very clear.
That is what an amazing arc that you know. I mean, lots of times I'm sure there are stories like that that you don't know, but you can hang on to that one for a long
Yeah.
time.
She and I have kept in touch throughout these many years since she graduated. And that's been one of the benefits of being the CEO for so long,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your transformation over 20 years being the CEO, because I know some of your story and you didn't start out as a CEO. It wasn't something that you had done. And yet here you are with a thriving organization and about to make a transition out of that role. So just maybe a little bit about what that looks like.
My involvement with the Bean Project began as a volunteer. So I have two science degrees. And I worked for in medical education for a number of years, and then I worked in tech. And I was working for a company that was not based in Colorado. I'm a fifth generation Coloradan. I moved away after college and then eventually realized, oh, turns out the sun doesn't shine everywhere every day, but it does in Colorado. So I returned here. And I think that when you commit to a community being your home,
Hmm.
what you also do is take on a responsibility to make that community better. So I was looking for a way to give back to the community, and I began to get involved with the Bean Project. I was on the sales and marketing committee for a little while. That was because that at that point that was my work, was
Hmm.
sales and marketing. And I did that for about 6 months until the position of CEO came open at the Bean Project. And I loved the idea of this business. The better the business does, the more women could be served.
Right.
That's maybe about as much as I knew, but I thought it was a cool concept. I tried to talk a girlfriend of mine into applying for the CEO position. And according to her, I just went on and on about what a great place it was until finally she said, if you think it's so great, why don't you apply? And my first reaction was, "Oh, no, I'm not a nonprofit person." And her response was, "Well, it's a business, and you know that." So we know how it turned out. I obviously applied for the job and got it. What changed for me was initially maybe it was more an intellectual exercise,
Hmm.
like I liked the business model, to then meeting the women. So I have the opportunity to meet the women during their first week when maybe they don't know exactly why they're there. Maybe somebody's told them you should go to Women's Being Project. And because they've been chosen out of a group of a couple hundred,
Yeah.
they feel very fortunate to have gotten the job. But beyond that, I don't think they really know what they're in for. So I get to meet them that first week and talk to them about the change that they're going to experience, which is something I've witnessed, but they don't know it yet.
Right.
And then I get to literally watch them blossom. I think in your lifetime, if you get to do work where you get to watch someone else's transformation, you're really lucky.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, and I know you get to do this in your work, but a lot of times when you do the kind of work that we do, you don't actually, it's really kind of hard to see, especially at a CEO level,
Hmm.
it's really hard to see the impact. You spend a lot of your time in an office or something like that, working with the people who maybe several layers
Hmm.
below your your level are doing the hands-on work. And what I've appreciated about this is, they are employees, the women who are going through our program.
Right.
And so I get to watch the trajectory of the people who are, part of our company.
Yeah. That's amazing. So, unless you're a unicorn, the last 20 years hasn't been super easy and everything's gone right and every decision's been perfect for you and the organization. So, can you talk a little bit about the twists and turns, ups and downs, whatever your right phrase is for, going from where you were to where you are now?
It was a long and winding road, buddy.
Cue the music. Right.
Yes, exactly. So when I started as the CEO of Women's Being Project in 2003, what I didn't have a full appreciation for was the level of crisis the organization had gone through in 2002.
Mm,
I kind of knew it had been in trouble. And in fact, what I learned was it was a level of crisis that was no guarantee the organization would survive.
yeah.
So in 2002, community members, board members rallied and at least kept the organization open for a
Hmm.
period of time until I came in June of 2003. And we were about a $300,000 a year organization at that time. Today we're about 3.5 million.
Hmm. Wow.
What I now have a much better appreciation for was how many systems just weren't working.
Hmm.
And I will also say it's a lot easier to Monday morning quarterback than to understand what the problems are when you're in the midst of the problems. I would say particularly if you've created them, but I had the advantage that I haven't created them. So I was always really careful not to be critical in a way that was as though, well, those other people were the ones who ruined this,
Right.
because I think that's also really important.
Hmm.
Because I do think when you come in after the fact with clear eyes, it's a lot easier to identify
Yeah.
the challenges of our organization were at so many levels, and I think that's the part that was overwhelming. From really being very clear on how do we make our products, and having SOPs in place and things like that. There wasn't a lot of clarity on that. And so when that happens and you have turnover, if the institutional knowledge lies with the people who are not there anymore, we all know you lose that institutional
Yeah.
knowledge versus having everything documented. But I think it was even much more fundamental than that. Not how we do what we do, but why do we do what we do?
Yeah.
And what does success look like? So we say we're an organization that's helping women transform their lives, and yet we couldn't define what that transformation would look like.
Right.
And what I know for sure is that when you don't define what success looks like, other people do it for you. And you usually don't like what they've decided. And so it's a really great opportunity to say, or to determine
Hmm.
what your success will be and what that North Star is, the why you do the work. And then what you have to do is you have to build to that. So if for us it is that women move towards self-sufficiency, we don't necessarily believe, depending on where she starts, that she would get to self-sufficiency by the time she leaves
Hmm.
us. But a path to employment over the long term is a path to self-sufficiency. What we know is that when people are employed for the majority of 36 months,
Hmm.
so of 30 years, the incidence of poverty is only 2.6%.
Really?
So that's the reason to do the work, right?
Yeah.
Is to
Right.
set them on a path where we make it very unlikely that she and her family would live in poverty.
Hmm.
But with that in mind, then you have to say, okay, what are all the things we need to do to help the women overcome the barriers, the things that have gotten in the way of that? And that was probably, in hindsight, I would say, one of the most important things
Hmm.
that I led our organization in doing, because that whole was something. When you don't have, I think of it like all the things you could do as an organization or a company being in sort of this big barrel, and there's bunches of opportunities inside the barrel. And if you don't have a filter for
Yeah.
that barrel, everything you pull out could look good.
Hmm.
And that's the challenge I think too many companies have, and especially when you have entrepreneurial kinds of leaders.
Yeah.
It would be really easy to think every idea is a good one if you don't have a filter for your barrel.
Yeah. So clearly, you've done nothing fatal. You're here, and the organization is thriving and 10 times bigger than it was when you came. Can you talk about a few decisions that weren't the right ones? You know, not that you didn't learn, but that oof, that took us off track or set us back.
I would say that some of the decisions that I made early on where I needed to pull back were ones where I got ahead of everybody else.
Mm.
And I speak to that a little bit in my book,
Hmm.
Followership, but where it was very clear to me why we needed to make the change because I was intimately involved and I was the one having sleepless nights because of payroll
Yeah.
and worrying about, all right, we just paid everybody. And then 2 weeks, we're going to have to do that again. So in my mind, the solutions I had come up with made perfect sense, but I didn't bring people along with me
Mm.
necessarily.
Right.
And those were times when I had to pull back and take several steps back, not to have a different solution necessarily, but to bring people with me.
Hmm.
And one of the things I've said a lot, if you're a leader and you look behind you and there's no one there, it turns out you're not leading.
You're just alone.
Yes, exactly. So I would say, in my mind, a lot of those things were much more like that. We did have a catering business at one point in time. I inherited that business,
Hmm.
and we were really bad at it. And we built our catering business based on transporting soup to locations. And that is a really bad product to try to transport. We had these, kettles of soup, and we'd take them in the van, and they'd slosh around the whole trip. And by the end, we had a half a kettle of soup. And it was things like that where we spent about 18 months making changes
Hmm.
and pivoting and trying to figure out how to salvage the business until finally I had this revelation that the same revenue we were making in the catering business, if we made that revenue in our food manufacturing business, it would employ probably 5 times the number of women. And as soon as I was able to
Wow.
sort of sort of reconfigure that decision in my own mind to
Hmm.
be, it's not a, this isn't actually a revenue decision. This is a mission decision.
Yeah.
Not only was it easier for me to make the decision, but it was easier for me to enlist people
Yeah.
to come with me on that decision. So I'd say, most of my missteps have been around not really understanding that I needed to bring people with me.
Yeah. Well, look, that's a perfect segue to talk about fellowship. And I love how you flip that idea. There are tons of books, literally, written about leadership. And
Mhm.
the idea that you have to be worth following and you have to have a reason for people to follow, and understanding what that means on both sides of that equation. I'm super into how you've positioned it, how you talk about it. But sort of lay out, I know this is your second book. So what's different this time about what you're writing and talking about? And then talk a little bit about the lessons in the book.
Yeah, I think writing a book is a, it's a very personal endeavor no matter what. And when you sit and you're writing, and I'm sure you know this too, it's very solitary and you're kind of in your own head and you're
Hmm.
trying to get your thoughts out, and eventually you have an editor, so sort of reveal it to one person at a time, a couple of people at a time. There is a point at which it becomes public, and I feel it's a very vulnerable time.
Yeah.
That's the part that's scary, right? What I know now is the writing part's not really scary at all. It's the publishing part that's the scary part. And at the same time, I felt as though I had learned all these lessons, and that I felt like the conversations we were having weren't necessarily the right conversations. And I've watched throughout the book, as you know, there are examples, not only my personal
Hmm.
examples, but examples of other leaders who aren't necessarily emblematic of fantastic leadership across the board,
Yeah.
but there are things about them that they did really well. And I wanted to try to point that out. That they were an example of perhaps great vision,
Hmm.
or they're an example of great integrity, even though we could probably criticize them for many other things. I wanted to call these lessons out things. And what I did was I categorized it into four areas: vision. And I think that gets lost a lot, that
Hmm.
the leader of the organization is responsible for creating the vision and then enlisting people to come with them. I think too often leaders get very caught up in the work,
Hmm.
and they really, especially those who are newer to leadership,
Yeah.
they're really high level managers. They're not leading, and they're worried about how much time people are spending at their desks. For instance, they've lost the fact that it's not really about how much time somebody spends in the office. It's how enlisted they are in the
Yeah.
vision for the organization, and what are the results looking like. So that's one. Integrity is another. None of your listeners will be surprised to hear this. We have a really big problem with trust in our country,
Yeah.
and actually around the world. And integrity is one of the most important reasons why. A
Hmm.
lack of integrity, a even doing some things as simply as doing what you say you're going to do, following through, uh, showing that you believe in others. So, and that's really one of the
Yeah.
basic tenets of Women's Being Project. Is what we often say is, we believe in the women until they can begin to believe in themselves.
Yeah.
I think that's a part of that. And then courage. I think too often we lead without courage. We avoid hard conversations because they're hard, and we don't do the most important actions that require us to lead with courage. And the last one is emotional intelligence. And so these lessons that I've learned are really about, maybe not necessarily because I think leadership and fellowship it's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
So not necessarily because I feel I've nailed them all, but because I think they're all things that we should, if we aspire to all of these things, we would all be better leaders,
Yeah.
and people would want to be following us. And I think that's what gets lost is we get so caught up in our leadership that we're not thinking about what people want from us.
Hmm. So I just finished a book. Maybe you've read it. It ties into something you just said. It's Simon Sinek's book, The Infinite Game. And
Mhm.
he made a great point that ties to your vision point of everybody else in the C-suite, the chief marketing officer, finance officer, you know what they do because it's in their title. And you say chief executive officer, and everybody's like, don't know what that means. And his suggestion was it should be called the chief vision officer. Like that's the main job of the person in that role. And so I think how you said it was really beautiful, because without that, people don't follow. They might march with you. They might be coerced or do it for the paycheck, but they're not enlisted. So just talk a little bit more about the fellowship piece, because I don't think there's much focus on what it means to have people who want to, like, who do you have to be so that people will do that? And maybe some of the lessons you've learned there.
One of the most important things is, and I tried to put my follower hat on a bunch of times when I was writing this book. Don't we all want to know that our leader cares about us and that they care that we're there and
Mm-hmm.
that we're part of the team? And I think a lot of times we as leaders treat those relationships as very transactional. Sort of, are you doing your job? What have you done for me lately? Are
Mm-hmm.
we making our numbers? Are you making your numbers? Versus a much greater investment in our people as people.
Yeah.
I want to know who you are. I think we should all want to know who our employees are. Are they married? Do they like bike riding? Do things that are just really show that you care about the person as a person? I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a really important thing. I also think that a follower needs to be able to trust that you as a leader are going to do something that's hard,
Mm.
whether you know it takes a toll or not, that you're going to do the right thing even when it's hard.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times a follower would not have any faith that their leader would do something that is challenging. I think one of the interesting dynamics in our country is we have a tendency to put leaders on pedestals.
Yeah.
We do that, and we've all watched leaders who have not only been placed on that pedestal, but then exploit that pedestal.
Yeah.
And I give a few examples in my book about people. I often say people make the decision whether or not support Women's Being Project based on meeting me. We all need to be clear, and mostly I need to be clear that it's not about me.
Yeah.
And the moment I begin to think it's about me, we're all in trouble. And
Yeah.
so we have this interesting dynamic because we put leaders on pedestals, and then we kind of resent them for being on that pedestal if they act like they should be there.
Right. Right.
And or they disappoint us. We put them in this place and they disappoint us through their actions when they're not courageous and they're not visionary, and you can't trust them to do what they say they're going to do. And so I think that's a lot of what I wanted to talk about, is that there's this interesting dynamic. You need to behave as though you belong there in that moment as a part of leadership, but the pedestal isn't really above everyone. It actually is kind of, I would say, more in front of everyone,
Mm-hmm.
and your job is to bring people along with you.
So Tamara, how do you do that? I mean, you've probably got other people in your life who are like, hey girl, you can maybe not breathe your own exhaust all the time. You've maybe got a spouse, maybe you've got a board. How do you make sure that you are getting good feedback and kind of calibrated to, am I ahead or above or someplace I shouldn't be as the leader?
One of the ways we do that, we have a strategic plan that
Mm-hmm.
every few years we update. uh, the process of creating the strategic plan is very organic, and the entire staff team and the board are enlisted in helping us with that strategic plan. It happens over about a 9-month period, so that by the time I do have the ultimate responsibility for, and it's, I think, really because it's kind of my jam. And so other organizations might do better having a consultant who helps with the actual writing of the plan. But by the time the strategic plan is finished, we've been talking about the direction and the vision of the organization. So my job is to be the chief vision officer. But before that, we've gotten to that articulation of that vision and the next 3 to 5 years of strategy. We have it's almost like, well, yeah, I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. This isn't news to us. But my job, I see, is, and this is one of the lessons, is to be the dot connector.
Mm-hmm.
I should be looking at what's happening in the environment, where things are going, what's happening with the women we serve, what's happening within the organization, and be able to coalesce all of those things into a vision that makes sense
Mm-hmm.
for where our organization should go next. when I've done that well, people, by the time the strategic plan is written, people are repeating back to me
Yeah.
what the overarching goals are. So we had a process a couple of strategic plans ago where we talked about serving more women better,
Hmm.
which is not necessarily grammatically correct, but and there was a lot of conversation around, should we put a comma, or should we change what it said? But when I knew we were onto something was when staff members would come to me and say, "Well, these are the changes I want to make, and this is how we would do it, and this is when we would roll it out, because this is how we're going to serve more women better."
That's a good moment.
Talk about, yeah, that's a really good moment. And then board members started saying, "Well, is this the path to serving more women better?" And so that has been, even though
Mm,
we have now a new strategic plan, we still make reference to that idea of serving more women better. I call that, and certainly other authors have, that's a sticky moment, right?
right. Yeah.
When it's how everybody is making reference to the work that you're doing. That only happens when you've spent that time to bring people along.
Yeah.
So you don't go off in a closet somewhere and write a strategic plan. You're really, it's maybe more of a net metaphor, right? You're sort of gathering things and ideas and issues,
Hmm.
gathering them to coalesce into a vision for the future of the organization. It takes a lot of patience.
Yeah.
I think most leaders aren't would struggle to have the patience to do it, but it's worth it when you have people repeating back to you
Yeah.
the things that you've dreamed of.
Yeah. So I could do this for a long time, Tamara, but I'm going to respect your time. And so I have two questions we'll finish up with. So the first one is around 20 plus years as the CEO, and I know you've begun the process to look for a successor. Can you just talk a little bit about that decision, your decision, and organizationally how it's going to carry out, and what's next for you?
I believe there's a right leader for the right time. And the key as a leader is to not be the last one to realize time is up. You don't want everybody else looking at their watches while you're oblivious. In 2022, Women's Bean Project moved to a new building. It's twice the size of our old building. And a month later, we had finished our capital campaign. So we were able to pay off our bridge loan. So we're in a $7
Bravo.
million building with no debt.
Wow.
And we also were able to put about $1 million in the bank. So now we're able to
Incredible.
be our own line of credit. We're
Hmm.
not needing our bank's line, which is really great considering how interest rates have increased lately. It occurred to me during that process that now is a good time to go.
Hmm.
Now I can point to, and it's never really been, about a legacy per se, but that's a good legacy. It's a good place to leave the
Hmm.
organization, particularly from where we started. And I also began to wonder, what could the next leader do? What could they dream
Hmm.
of? And I think it's time for that next person to
Yeah.
to take the mantle and take the organization to the next level. If I were selfish, I think I might say, "Oh gosh, I really want to get us to, you know, $5 million in revenue or 10 million or whatever." But it's that, then that would be about me.
Yeah.
And I really hope that something like that is the vision that the next leader brings. But I feel very at peace with where I'm leaving,
Hmm.
and excited for what the next person can where the next person can lead the
Yeah.
organization. So we're in the midst of the search,
Hmm.
and I will leave June 30th, 2025.
Okay.
What I'm doing, my second book came out, Fellowship, as you talked about, and I really intentionally wrote that to serve as a platform for keynote speaking.
Hmm.
I've also had a side hustle for a couple of years. The Economic Mobility Fellow for a think tank here in Colorado. I'll continue that work, which uses a really different part of my brain,
Right.
much more analytical part of my brain. I'm doing some coaching and mentoring
Hmm.
for, I think, especially for new leaders, that first 3 to 6 months,
Yeah.
potentially when you're just taking over, really understanding what that transition from manager to leader looks like. And I'm going to be a cobbler, buddy. I'm going to cobble things together. I'm really excited about this idea of doing a bunch of different things.
Yeah. I met with someone last week who he was in his early 50s, stepped down from a big role, and he talked about a portfolio life. He's on a public company board. He's doing stuff with his family. He's traveling, and he's doing some coaching and mentoring. And he's like, I do enough of what I want to do all the time. He said, and he's never been happier. So sounds like that's where you're headed.
That's maybe that sounds better than cobbling.
I was going to offer you a job at Souls for Souls helping us fix shoes, but now I realize that was too literal. So the last question, Tamra, is a little different version of the what do you wish your 25-year-old self knew? So I want you to talk forward. So to your 20-year from now self, what do you want to make sure she remembers about now, like where you are in this moment?
Well, the most important thing to me is that I didn't not do something because I was afraid. So it's funny you say 20 years from now. I do have this, I have what I call my park bench analysis. When I'm 80, sitting on a park bench, it used to be 70, and then I realized that was too close. So when I'm 80, sitting on a park bench, looking back at my life, as I analyze whether or not I'm going to pursue something, will I regret not having done this? And not only that, if fear is the only reason that I'm pulling back or I'm not doing it, that's not good enough. So I have an agreement with myself that fear can't be the only reason. Like getting your leg chopped off or something like that, that would be a reason not to. But fear alone of just, this intellectual or emotion around, gosh, I've never done that before, that's not a good enough reason. So I guess 20 years from now, what I'd love to be in a position to do is look back on my life and say, in all my park bench analyses, there was never a time when I didn't do something because I was afraid.
Mic drop right there. Perfect. Great way to end. So thanks to everybody who's listening. Really check out Tamra's book, Fellowship. It is so good. It's thoughtful. It's got lots of examples, and it speaks to, I think, where any leader is, big, small, for-profit, not-for-profit. So there's a lot of great stuff there. And Tamra, thanks for the effort to write that. I know it is not an easy process. So thanks for putting that out in the world.
Thank you, Buddy. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Repurpose Podcast with Buddy Teaster. You can learn more about what we do at s4s.org. And if you like this content, please share, rate, and review our episodes wherever you get your favorite podcasts.